Thank you all for being here this afternoon. We're excited to be welcoming our guest speaker to campus today. I want to thank the Law School and the Bacchus Institute and Montana Campus Compact, as well as the Masters of Public Administration program for co-sponsoring the event this afternoon. I'm Andrea Vernon. I'm the Executive Director of Montana Campus Compact and Director of Civic Engagement here at the University of Montana. And so it's my pleasure to be able to do a little introduction for our speaker today. Dr. Andrew Seligsohn is the president of National Campus Compact, and before joining Campus Compact in 2014, Andrew served as Associate Chancellor for Civic Engagement and Strategic Planning at Rutgers University Camden, where he worked across the campus to develop the university's engagement infrastructure to maximize community impact and student learning. Andrew previously served as Director of Civic Engagement Learning in the PACE Center at Princeton University. And he served as a faculty member in the Department of Political Science at Hartwick College, where he earned tenure and promotion to the rank of Associate Professor and was elected Chair of the faculty there. Andrew also taught both at Princeton and Rutgers and has published articles and chapters on constitutional law, political theory, urban politics, and youth civic engagement. Andrew holds a PhD in political science from the University of Minnesota and a BA in modern intellectual history from Williams College. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Seligsohn.
Good afternoon. So a couple logistical things. Can people hear pretty well and we got good sound? Okay, that's good. Second thing, I was just reminded, so I'm a baseball fan. I grew up in New York. I'm a Yankee fan. And it used to be that in Yankee Stadium, on the playing field, there were these statues of Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. They were put literally on the field way in deep center field. And that changed. They moved the fences in many years ago. But there was a Red Sox center fielder named Jimmy Pearsall who had a kind of a quirky sense of humor. And one thing he'd like to do was in the middle of the game, he would just hide behind one of the statues, and people would turn and be like, what happened to Pearsall? We lost our center fielder. I feel like I have the same opportunity. This is my point. This is where I'm heading. So if I disappear for a little while, I'll probably reappear on the other side of a column, whatever. If you're trying to hide, you might need to move around. So that's your call. So can I start by just figuring out a tiny little bit about who you all are, like in the form of raising your hand. So how many of you are students at the moment? Okay. And how many of you are faculty? All right. And how many of you are primarily neither students nor faculty? Okay. All right. This is interesting. So this is where I'm going to break through the fourth wall and give you a little insight into what I was planning and how I'm going to adjust it on the fly. So I had sort of built this imagining that most of the people that I was talking to were going to be faculty. And I'm happy to talk to people who are not faculty. I'm happy to talk to people who are faculty. It's all good with me. But I was sort of envisioning this as having like a workshop dimension around courses that people were teaching. So we're going to shake this up a little bit and just dig into some of the same issues, but not necessarily with that as the sole frame. But I think still thinking about what do we think an education should look like and what might courses look like in that universe. So that'll make sense as I go. The other thing I just want to say, since I don't have a clicker, I'm going to be diving over here to move slides along. And so that's a little background. So now I'm going to dig in. I've talked enough about what I'm going to do. I'll start doing it. So the context for all of this, and so one thing also you just need to know, you'll have another chance at these Twitter handles at the end. I know many people, if they are not tweeting, they don't feel like they're experiencing whatever they're doing. So I didn't want anybody to have a panic attack in that way. The context for the work that I'm going to talk about is this organization that I lead nationally. Andrea leads here in Montana, and many others who are here work for and in partnership with Campus Compact. So I just wanted to say a little bit about who we are and why this work of education for democracy right now feels like our most pressing agenda. And then to say a little bit, again, about how we might do some of that work and think about it together. So Campus Compact is a coalition of about 1,000 colleges and universities across the United States mostly. We also have some international members. And what they share is a commitment to what we talk about as the public purposes of higher education. And we think about that as being primarily embodied in educating students for effective participation in our democracy and building partnerships between campuses and communities to achieve a variety of public goods in education, in health, in community economic development, and in other areas. And so we work as a membership organization of colleges and universities. So we have, again, about 1,000 members. Collectively, they educate about 6 million students at a time. We've been around for some 30-odd years, and we have about 30 state and regional compacts across the country, some single states, some multi-states, that are the people on the ground in places building partnerships, building relationships, working directly with colleges and universities. And we both play a role in making the case to colleges and universities. So we are joined by presidents and chancellors making the case that colleges and universities both have an obligation to think about the public good and to build it into the work they do, but also that there are tremendous opportunities in that for student learning, for deepening research, for otherwise building stronger connections between the institution and communities beyond the campus to benefit people in and beyond the university. And that ultimately, both for public and for private nonprofit institutions, serving the public good is at the core of their mission. And virtually every university in its mission statement, one way or another, describes its purpose in those terms. So in some ways, you know, in a universe where people think primarily about the private good questions about higher education, about the cost of higher education to individuals, about the economic benefits that college education brings to individual students, part of what we're arguing is that all of those things are very important, but also they should be situated in the context of a conversation about how we're going to succeed and thrive collectively at the level of local communities, at the level of states, at the level of the whole country. And part of the story is we thrive when we create pathways for individuals to achieve their own goals, but also we thrive when we create the conditions under which those opportunities are widely available to everyone, and when we're working together to address challenges and seize opportunities in our places and beyond. So that's a little bit about who we are, about the work we do. How we actualize that, I'll just say a little bit about, again, just sort of for background and context, is we work directly with a number of constituencies. So we work with colleges and university presidents and chancellors, and a lot of that is kind of an agenda setting function. We want these leaders of these institutions to be thinking about these issues, to be recognizing, again, the opportunities for their institutions in taking seriously public good work, in helping them to see how they can, through sort of tone setting and setting the issue agenda on their own campuses, lead students, faculty, staff in thinking together about this work. We also connect with professionals, with faculty and staff, helping people think about how do you build courses and programs and experiences for students that join students and community members, that link faculty and their research to the needs and opportunities in communities. So a lot of our work is directly with professionals on university campuses. We connect directly with students in a variety of ways, but primarily at the national level through our Newman Civic Fellows program. So we have 270 fantastic students from across the country who are identified by their presidents and chancellors as kind of people who are leading this work on their campuses and in their communities. And one of them, Sophie, is right with us. And we are about to hold this coming weekend, like I guess it's tomorrow or the next day or something, our national conference of our Newman Civic Fellows in Boston. So Sophie and I are basically racing each other back east for that event this weekend. So that's just a little bit about how we operate here in Montana, and the folks who are here, if we want to afterward kind of in conversation. A lot of the work is happening through partnerships with national service programs, VISTA and AmeriCorps, which is also a characteristic of our compacts across the country, and again in work with all of the 18 institutions who are members of Montana Campus Compact across the state of Montana. That's, again, a bit about the background to who we are and what we do in a general way. And as I said, we have come to think that a central piece of our agenda right now is focusing with laser-like precision on questions about students and participation in democracy, in the political processes that are at the core of democracy as a form of government. And there's a lot more to be said about what democracy is and how we might think about it. And a lot of the work we've done over decades that puts students in the context of community efforts, we think of as having to do with the broader effort to build genuinely democratic spaces in the places we live where people are working together to solve problems. But I think we've come to the conclusion over the last few years that there's a special need right now to be focused on connecting students with the formal processes of democratic governance through elections, through efforts to shape public policy, through other means of participation that has to do with the binding institutions of our democratic systems and processes. And again, that's a topic we can talk much more about, sort of thinking more about democracy as a way of life, or thinking more broadly about democracy as a way of life, and thinking about democracy as a set of political processes kind of governed by law, et cetera, and why we think that's important. But just to get into some of the background, in 2015, our network came together. So this is folks who are leading the work in our states, presidents from across the country, about 70 of us in a room talking about, that was the 30th anniversary of our national compact, talking about what we thought the next phase of our work required. And so this was, again, to reiterate, 2015, which I think of as a simpler time in American life. But when we sat down, we really said that what we thought we needed to respond to when we thought about the 30 years history of our work was the fact that during that time, the challenge that our organization had been created to address, which is the need to reinvigorate our democracy and our people's connection to community locally and nationally. We saw that we'd done a lot of good work in that area, and we could talk about all the programs we've built and the experiences for students that happen now that didn't used to happen 30 years ago and all that. But we also saw that the challenge that we were facing had grown dramatically. And that was really driven, we thought, by two things. One is the explosion of inequality in the country. So, if you look again back to the late 70s, early 80s, and you compare it to now, and I think most people are familiar with this data in different forms, but the share of wealth in the country has floated, sort of dramatically upward. The share of income has gone dramatically upward. An enormous gap has opened up between people at the top who are doing very well and most of the rest of the country who are doing less well. Most of the economic growth gains over the last 40 years have basically been sort of eaten up by a very small percentage of people at the top. This is where the language of the 1% comes from, et cetera. And one can have different views about the policies that got us there and what are appropriate ways to regulate the economy and not, and there's legitimate room for disagreement. But it's a fact of American life that a consequence of all of that is that we have people, many more people in the country who are living within communities that are income defined and where their personal experience of life in America is vastly different from people living in other income defined communities, right? We are much less likely than we were 40, 50 years ago to live close to people with very different incomes from ours. We're much less likely to go to schools with people in different income categories. There's a lot of research that's come out about the degree to which you can predict a lot about people's lives based on what zip code they are born into. And so we saw that as one of the forces pulling us apart, making us much less likely to understand the experiences of people whose lives are different from ours simply because we don't interact with them very much in ways that might have happened when there was more mixing of incomes and where generally the sort of income curve was a lot flatter. So the gap between people, even if you were in a different place on the income spectrum, the distance just wasn't that great. So that's one force, inequality. The other is polarization. And I think, again, this has become, in the last couple of years, a topic of much more widespread conversation, especially in the sort of the way that this has shown up digitally, et cetera. But for 3-4 decades now, political scientists, I happen to be a political scientist, have identified growth in polarization measured a whole bunch of different ways. So within our legislatures, there's a lot more voting according to party lines. There's much less collaboration across. So we see that in the Congress, often in state legislatures, and it's real and it's measurable and it's been demonstrated. But also polarization of opinion, right? And we tend now much more to sort opinions in clusters. So again, if you looked at the opinions that a person held 50 years ago, the likelihood that they would hold a whole set of opinions, all of which looked liberal or all of which looked conservative, was much lower than it is now. We now sort of figure out who's our tribe, right? And then whatever set of opinions kind of goes with that, we find ourselves adopting all of them. It's not how we consciously think of what's happening, but it's what happens. And then the more we're also separated from people whose experiences are unlike ours, the more all of that gets reinforced. So if I spend my time around people mostly like me, I kind of tend toward the dominant opinions in that group, and all of a sudden we find that within one group, everybody thinks one set of things, and with another group, everybody thinks another set of things, and the opportunity to work together to address big challenges diminishes dramatically. And for me, one of the biggest pieces of evidence of this is just that if we ask ourselves, if you think right now about what you think of as, say, the 2 or 3 biggest problems facing the country, so if you pause for just a moment, formulate that, whatever you think of. And then you ask yourself, what do you feel is the likelihood, say in the upcoming Congress, that the Congress will pass legislation that is really likely to make big progress on those issues, right? How many of you are pretty confident that the Congress is about to deal with something you identify in your own mind as one of the really big challenges? Yeah, I think you're probably right. Right? So like that, it doesn't matter what your particular political views are, where you sit on the political spectrum, what you think are the right or wrong solutions. The fact that we don't have confidence that our institutions will, with any likelihood, address the things we think are the big challenges, that is a crisis for a democratic system, right? Because our faith that it's worth it to invest our time and our effort and our belief in maintaining these institutions, if we don't actually think they're going to solve any of the problems that the world faces, it's hard to sustain that over time, right? So when we think about why should our work right now be especially focused on democracy understood as these formal institutions and connecting students to them and developing in them the capacities to work in and through them, that's why, to a large extent, that kind of breakdown. So this initiative that we are launching called Education for Democracy has a single kind of big goal, which is to ensure that every college student builds the key capacities for thoughtful and effective participation in our democracy. So that sounds good, but you might wonder, well, what does it mean? And one aspect of what it means is, what do we mean by the key capacities for thoughtful and effective participation in democracy? So I want to throw that open right now. Who has like a candidate for what might be a key capacity that a person would need to be a thoughtful and effective participant in democratic processes? What sort of capacities, would actually fit that description? Yeah.
The ability to talk to others that have an opinion different than our own.
Okay, and talk to, and probably listen, right, as related to that. Yes, exactly, engaging in communication across differences of opinion. So that sounds like a really good candidate. What else?
Knowledge of how the system works.
Okay, you just have to understand how does the whole thing work. And it's like in the United States, we have a very complicated system, right? Because we have local governments and state governments and the federal government. We intentionally have separation of powers among branches. So there's a lot of moving parts, and it can be very complex. And a lot of people just don't understand all of it. So just knowledge of how the system works, really important. What else?
Being an informed voter.
Okay, so knowing about like candidates and issues that are showing up in particular elections. So it's one part of the knowledge is underlying knowledge about how the system works, and then another part is what's at stake in this campaign. Who are the candidates? What do they believe? What are their qualifications, et cetera? That's great. Was that? I thought I saw another hand somewhere. Right.
I was just going to say compassion for certain things that you care about.
Okay, so that's interesting, right? Because that sounds a little bit different from some of the other things we've just said, compassion. And why would you say that that's a key capacity for effective and thoughtful participation in democracy?
For me, at least, personally, I tend to participate when I feel strongly about something, whether that be, examples would be things like climate change or people or legislation that is focused on that, or I don't know, other issues.
Okay, yeah, like at a deep level, like you have to care, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so like you can know a lot and you can be informed and whatever, but if you don't care, the likelihood that that will turn into action, that it'll become participation is really low. So compassion is sort of one pathway into caring. I think that's a great way to think about it. Yeah. Other thoughts about it? Yeah.
I would say like geographical location to get more involved. People are living out in rural Montana. They're probably less likely to come in to town or wherever to be more involved in political perspective of what's going on in the city or the town.
Okay, so we might flip that around and say that maybe is less sort of a capacity of individuals, but that like a feature of systems, right? Is that somehow we need to create access for, and again, like, you know, so we can think about that in very literal ways, like vote by mail, right, as a way to open up access to participation. But certainly, even if you have these individual, I mean, I think that raises just the interesting point for me that even if you kind of do the things to get individuals ready, we also have to be thinking about systems and ensuring that our values are actually reflected in the way they're built, such that if we value everybody's participation, we're asking the question of how do we enable access for people living in locations that are distant from population centers or whatever, which is an interesting point as well, yeah.
I would suggest that maybe a key capacity is open-minded, because you were talking earlier about we're all in one way and another way, and that's it. But if you can't come to the table and see multiple sides or multiple perspectives or be open to diversity or open to different issues, then you're kind of stifling the conversation to be effective in your participation in the democratic process.
Okay, and I would think it's interesting, right? We might talk, there was a book, I think in the early 90s or something called Habits of the Heart, right? And so we might think about sort of compassion as sort of certain habits of the heart and open-mindedness as certain habits of mind, right? That you have to be prepared to actually take seriously, and this has to do with this point about being able to talk to people who you don't already agree with, that you have to cultivate somehow the capacity to take seriously the idea that the thing you think right now might not be the best way of looking at something, right? And again, that sort of runs contrary to a whole bunch of basic psychological orientations we have, et cetera. So this is one of those good times where you know, you sort of set something up and you hope that it kind of works out in terms of what people, this worked out, this is good. So I'm going to say a little bit about how we've been thinking about these capacities. So the first one we've identified as political understanding. So, and again, this, you know, we're sort of saying that as the knowledge of current issues and events in historical context needed to judge the soundness of public policies and to hold representatives accountable. And that also certainly implies understanding how systems work. So part of this is understanding and knowledge, the kind of cognitive stuff that you need. So that's one of the things that we see as like a big bucket that we are seeking to develop, right? And, you know, again, there's a lot of data points you could cite. A third of college graduates surveyed were unable to correctly identify the Bill of Rights. So just like knowing what are the basic governing documents that we operate under, and these are recent surveys, and 10% of college graduates believe Judge Judy is a Supreme Court justice, which is only funny until Judge Judy becomes a Supreme Court justice. And then it stops being as funny. But for now, so yeah, we have like just basic knowledge gaps. And when you look at all kinds of surveys that just test people's basic political knowledge in the United States, we just don't do that well, either understanding specific issues or about understanding of the system. So, and you know, this seems like a thing that college education ought to be pretty well suited to take on, right? Like this is, if colleges and universities are designed for anything, it's sort of, you know, helping people, you know, acquire new knowledge. And so far, we haven't done that so effectively. One question we can talk more about is like, have we been trying actually, right? So that's part of what we're up to. So political understanding is the sort of the first category of capacities. And then political skills. And again, I think when we're talking about things like I'll just say this, we identified this as the skills of political analysis and judgment, of assessing news and information, of communication and leadership, teamwork and collaboration. And again, there's a lot of data supporting this, that most, for example, younger people now are getting tons of political information from social media without great capacity to sort out what's real and what's not, right? What's true and what isn't true, coming from reliable sources or not. So the skills of being able to kind of tease things apart, and again, as we're talking about communicating with other people, as we're talking about beginning with like the possibility that you're not the only person who has good information or like good ideas, these are also parts of political skills that fit into communication, leadership, teamwork, collaboration, the possibilities of working together with others to achieve things, and also the possibilities of working across differences to listen, learn, presumably change one's own views, possibly sometimes persuade others, but create the opportunity for shared work and addressing, again, dealing with that big problem that right now we just don't think legislative bodies and others are going to solve the problems we face. So political skills. And my point is, you all were identifying these things, knowledge and skills. And then the last thing is political motivation. And again, this goes to what we were talking about, this sort of caring and really thinking these things matter and being willing. So the ability to see the relevance of political issues to one's life and understand that what one thinks and does politically matters. And the biggest evidence that we haven't gotten where we need to is voting participation. So the good news, right, is we just, in the midterm elections that just happened, we saw youth voting participation that looked like it was just about twice what it was at the midterms in 2014. So that's fantastic, right? There are very few social indicators where you can just double them from one time to the next. On the other hand, doubling it got us up to 31%. So there's still a long way to go before we're at anything remotely like full participation. And even in the presidential election, where turnout tends to be higher, youth turnout is still and student turnout well below half of all eligible folks. We won't have student data for the midterms until much later, just because of the way the data systems work. So we don't know that yet for 2018. We do have youth data because that's coming out of exit surveys. That's why we have different numbers. But the point is, a lot more students voted in 2018 than in 2014. A lot more young people more broadly voted in 2018 than in 2014. That's really good, and there's also an enormous distance to go between there and where we'd want to be to have a democracy where everybody's voice was represented equally. And again, as with other forms of voter participation, we still have huge sort of equity problems that have to do with patterns of participation. So, like among college students, white women participate at much higher levels than any other group. So that's great that white women are participating, but it would be great if everybody else were as well. So there's just an enormous amount of work to be done in building participation for everybody. And clearly, part of that has to do with whether you think it matters, right? So I think we have groups in the United States who have historically come to believe that their voice is not seen as important, that the things they think matter are not taken seriously by empowered institutions. And until we turn that around, those groups are unlikely to participate in the same numbers as groups who have historically felt like when they show up, people pay attention. So there's both just an overall issue to take on and then a specific equity-related issue. But the main point, for my purposes, is these ideas of political understanding and knowledge, political skills, and political motivations are the things that we're talking about when we say our effort is about building these essential characteristics or capacities for participation in democracy. That's what we're talking about, okay? And so the idea is to ask how colleges and universities, through the work we do with students, can more effectively and more universally develop these capacities in students, or enable students to develop these capacities for themselves, right? So that's the effort, again, as a way of taking on some basic features of the political landscape that we're now living in and seeing whether we can contribute to changing those. And again, we do this like we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We do this not because we have a particular set of policy outcomes in mind, but because we believe whatever policy outcomes we end up with should be those that are chosen by a broadly participating public at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level. Okay. Let me, before I go forward, see, are there any reflections on any of that? Thoughts, questions, just anything anybody wants to put on the table now? That always reflects, two possibilities. One, just crystal clarity, or complete confusion, just it's not even. Okay, I'm going to go with the first one. That's my assumption. All right, so this is the part where I'm about to move into the space that I had sort of built imagining a group of faculty, and we're just going to mix it up on the fly, as I said. So I hope everybody's okay with this. So what I thought that would be interesting to do is, as I said, this is an initiative that we are building, and I can talk a little bit later about some of the components that we're working on, just because it might be of interest, whatever. But because we're building it, and because you're people who are interested enough to show up to this thing, and you are connected to higher education and whatever, I was interested in having you brainstorm some ideas about what this might look like. And so the way I had thought about that was at the level of individual courses, and we could still kind of do it that way, but they don't have to be courses you yourself might teach. You might think about courses that you think should exist, or courses that you as a student are taking. Because one of the questions that we're interested in asking is, how can existing courses in college be tweaked in ways that help build political knowledge, political skills, political motivations? How can you take the material that students are already learning, interested in, choosing, and help them see how that material may connect to political possibilities, or may be more deeply understood when it's put in a context of the institutions of our democracy? So that's kind of what we're starting to mess around with. So the first step is, it says here, think about a course you teach, but I would say think about a course that you either teach or a course that you have taken or will be taking, in which you think there might be an opportunity to help students develop political knowledge, political skills, or political understanding. That should have said motivation. I just wrote the wrong word there on my slide, I just realized. And so let me maybe throw out some examples that could make this clear. So, for example, you might think about a history course in which you are studying periods of conflict over particular issues. Conflicts in the New Deal over how we are going to regulate the economy, how we're going to deal with the fact that there were, in the 1930s, many, many people living in poverty. And so in a history course, it might be quite natural to teach that and then move on from that, right? But there might be an opportunity to ask students to think about, are there parallel questions that we're facing today? What are the questions about government regulation that are on the table right now? What are the questions, what are the conflicts about addressing issues related to poverty that exist right now? And how might you express a view? If you're thinking through the lens of the Great Depression, you might develop some views about who was right and who was wrong in debates over whether the sort of Roosevelt administration's policies made sense. How might you express those views in a way that's active and useful in our current context, right? So that might be a way to, in a history course, embed some links to our current world. If you're teaching an environmental studies course, you might teach about a set of environmental processes. You might then ask students to consider, what are the regulatory agencies that actually govern what happens with these processes, right? And right now, what are the policies that they're moving toward? And are those views, does it make sense to you that we're moving those directions or not? And again, what are things, how would you literally get involved in seeking to push policy in a direction that you thought made sense based on your understanding of these issues, right? So those are a couple examples of the kinds of things we're talking about. So the first idea is, and what I was thinking of having folks do, is circling up a little bit. I think we can do that. So maybe if you cluster in 3s and 4s and I'm going to give you some further questions, but this is the first question, is like, what are some places where you could see this happening? So let's actually do that. Like, start conversations with the people around you about what are some courses where you could imagine, based on what you know, what you study, what you teach, getting those conversations going. Yeah, and you can like move around a little bit, whatever it takes to. So there were some more questions, if you haven't seen those, that I threw up on there, which are about how could you actually integrate the learning you thought might be possible, and what are some, this is sort of the exciting one, what are some practical experiences, like if you were thinking about designing an experience for students that's part of the course that would allow them to make those connections, so whether it's like a simulation, some kind of actual participation in some public process, something that you could integrate into the course that's a practical experience that would build kind of a real experiential understanding of the connections that you're talking about. So I'll give you a little bit more time to talk about that if you haven't already dug into it. So let's maybe rally up and just see like what are some ideas that just came out of your conversation. Like, could somebody give, if you got all the way from beginning to end, can somebody give just like a course that you're thinking about and maybe some kind of experience that students could engage in that might help reinforce some political learning that's connected to that course? Yeah.
We were talking about like designing a course. We were talking more about courses we have taken in the past. And I took a sustainability course, and we were required to subscribe to either the New York Times or the Washington Post. And I was explaining that that was the first time I had ever had a newspaper subscription, and really had read the newspaper. So I don't want to say the word forced, but it required me to read the whole thing and then choose an article to then write about. So it allowed me to become more politically informed, because I had that information in front of me and I was required to read it. And then we talked about a few more things Claire took a class where you have to take a field trip, and she went to Butte and looked at the Berkeley Pit. So that, I don't know if you wanted to explain more on that, but more of like experiential learning type things. I took a course where I had to volunteer 20 hours a semester with a local nonprofit. So I was saying maybe if it was within a separate type of course to then join or volunteer with a nonprofit that was more politically engaged. We thought that was practical ways or steps.
Okay, yeah, and I think, it's really interesting to think that we might think of like reading the newspaper as, in some ways, like a minimal form of participation, right? It's just reading the newspaper. We also have a lot of evidence, actually, that these lower level forms of participation tend to correlate with other forms. So if you get people reading the newspaper, they're more likely to take action of various kinds. And so I think that's a great example, like very low lift from the standpoint of the course, but just starts to build the connections to the actual world we're living in a way where you then may be motivated individually to take some action that you might not otherwise have taken. And again, yeah, lots of evidence that experiential learning just deepens learning, and especially deepens the sort of the heart side of things, right? Makes you care in a way that book learning may not on its own. So yeah, those are great examples. What other thoughts did people have about experiences that might connect to courses? Yeah.
I'm in an intro to American government class right now, and like we're learning a lot about how the system works and all the aspects that go along with it. And I thought that it would be cool that it would like make it a degree requirement for people to take intros to the American government.
Okay, so that's.
College student. I know it's like hard to do, but.
No, I mean, what's interesting about this is like people who are who work in universities, like over the long term, they get terrified about talking about changing requirements because it leads everybody to fight with each other, like all the faculty. But it is an interesting fact, right, that these institutions that identify their mission as having to do with the public good, and that do have a lot of requirements. It may be that none of those are actually connected with preparing people for participation in our political system. And so thinking about how could degree requirements be changed to actually reflect that mission is certainly an interesting part of the story, and would absolutely be a step toward building knowledge and understanding, et cetera. So yeah. I feel like I heard you guys talking about public meetings. Is that true? What was that conversation about?
I was saying how I'm in the American government class as well, and just having it as an assignment to go to a public meeting and then come back and talk about what you saw, what was going on, even like lectures like this or even anything else, just coming back and talking about what you saw, or putting them on the spot and say, hey, you need to talk about this, this, and this, debate your case right now, like that, just to simulate what you might do.
Yeah. No, and I think you know, one thing that is differentiates the U.S. political system from most in the world, right? So we said it's fairly complicated because of all these levels of government, but it also has very accessible public bodies, right? In every community in America, there's a city council or a town council or whatever it is. There are local courts. There are usually various kinds of, you know, zoning boards or planning boards or parks commissions, or there's all sorts of things. They mostly have meetings that are open to the public and nobody goes to them. And just walking in and sitting down and listening and seeing how these meetings are conducted, the possibility of being required to speak at some setting, right, and again, they're often dealing with issues. So if you're taking economics courses, there's all sorts of questions about local economic development that are being discussed in these public bodies. And I think it can be very powerful just to see that the people who are making these decisions are ordinary people like you who happen to have done something to get themselves, you know, up in front of that table instead of on the other side or whatever. But I think very often we don't introduce most residents in our communities, not just students, but I think most people just don't realize the access we have to decision-making bodies and how they work and how you would prepare to make a statement in front of them or bring an issue before them. So I think all those kinds of issues. Local human rights commissions is another one, right? Many, many communities across the country, and I don't know whether you have one here or not, but have human rights commissions that are empowered to protect people against discrimination, and they are usually, again, they have public meetings, et cetera. These are really interesting things to see in action. And then again, bringing back what you saw into the classroom, I think that's a great point, and discussing that, thinking about it critically. Were you happy with how this body operated? Do you think it's living up to our democratic values, or do you think it's a bunch of people who don't really listen to the citizens who come before them? Right? These are all issues to discuss. And once you've seen these bodies in action, your own motivation either to run for office or support candidates at the local level, elections you might ignore, or think about how do you get on that Parks Commission that's making decisions that I think are crazy right now, or whatever it is, that all goes up, right? And then, again, I think we just saw in this recent election cycle, a lot of people who just got motivated to get involved out of a sense that, I need to, got elected to public office all around the country at all sorts of levels. And again, I think those opportunities are sitting there for people, and connecting them to them can be really powerful. Any other ideas people wanted to share? Just thought about something you could do in a course to deepen the connection to political knowledge. All right. So as I said, this was kind of like a brainstorming thing, partly for me. I was ear hustling, stealing a little bit from these conversations, really good conversations. And I think part of the point is there are opportunities at the level of the curriculum, thinking about curricular requirements, et cetera. There are also all sorts of opportunities within individual courses. And again, I think these are things like if I were a student, I would think about suggesting to professors things that you think would be exciting to do, that you think would deepen learning. I think professors would be surprised by that and also very happy. Having been a professor, that would have been my experience. Oh, that's a really good idea. And I didn't know you would want to have me ask you to do something that might be a little more demanding and time consuming. I'd be glad to know it. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for influence in that direction. Let me just say a little bit more about what we're up to. So we've kind of built this initiative out of these kind of 6 areas. Student voting matters, the idea that people should understand electoral processes, how to be involved, how to help mobilize others to be involved. Also understanding what's wrong with our electoral processes now, why it's so hard in so many places for people to register and vote, what the barriers are to participation. Second one we're calling democracy in principle and practice. Again, understanding the systems, how they were designed, how they succeed, how they fail, and just having an understanding of what the context is for all of this activity. The third we're calling deliberation for a shared future. This is what we were talking about, this idea of learning how to talk to others across differences in opinion, how to listen well, how to build the possibility for collaboration for change. Media fact and fiction is about understanding and being able to distinguish reliable from unreliable political information. And then the last two are about building student leadership and about building teaching capacity to advance all of this work. And I think student leadership is the most powerful. That is to say, I think in general, students tend to systematically underestimate their own influence on campuses, and that when students are activated on issues, it makes a big difference. And I think if students were actively demanding a kind of education that would support their participation as citizens, their voice in our public life, institutions would respond to that. So I just hope that's like a thing that you might walk out with, some thinking about how you might make that happen. We are working on, I'll just say one last thing we're doing about this. We are working on, as a tool to advance all of that work, a digital platform. So this gets a little bit deep in the weeds, using a framework that's called Open Educational Resources. So the basic idea is it's online materials that are licensed under Creative Commons licensing, so there's no copyright on them. And they'd be made available free to all the members of Campus Compact, including this university and the others in the state. And the idea is that there would be high quality teaching and learning materials that do the kinds of things we were just talking about. Help faculty members see how to connect the subject matter they're teaching to the learning that builds political knowledge and skills and motivations. Because it's an OER platform, Open Educational Resources, people can modify, change, and share back changes they've made, these materials. And so the idea is to start to create a kind of trove of materials that we were just talking about, if you're a biology professor and you want people to understand what's the connection of the things they're learning in class to like public health questions, for example, or questions about, genetically modified organisms or whatever. Maybe there are teaching materials that you can pull down so you don't have to invent all of it from scratch and learn from that. So we're trying to build a national resource that will enable faculty across the country to build in this kind of learning everywhere, but also tailor it to the specific needs and opportunities in their places. So that's one of the pieces that we are building to try to move forward this initiative more broadly. That is what I have, and I think we're close to time. So again, I thank you. One more opportunity to grab up the Twitter stuff for the Twitter needful. So thank you. I appreciate it, as I said, your ideas. And I hope that at the very least stimulated some thinking about things you might do here as students, as instructors, as people trying to just move this stuff along. Help me to think about some things that we will try to move forward nationally. So thank you.
Yeah.